More than 4,000 Russian tanks and 13,000 armored vehicles are confirmed lost. In our planning, these numbers are staggering. To any commander, this data exposes a severe structural crisis within their ranks. Moscow launched this campaign with an armored advantage we believed was nearly inexhaustible. A massive Soviet-era reserve of battle tanks, infantry carriers, and fighting vehicles parked across vast depots. For decades, doctrine dictated this stockpile would sustain high-intensity mechanized warfare regardless of heavy initial losses. But relentless attrition is erasing that edge. Satellite imagery shows their legendary storage depots are quickly emptying out. Outdated platforms, the T-72, T-80, T-62, and even T-55 are being dragged back to the front. This is not a demonstration of strength, but proof that their strategic depth is hitting rock bottom. Down at the tactical level, the danger is far more acute. Their assault columns no longer resemble unstoppable classic armored spearheads. Overhead feeds show them as sitting ducks mapped by Ukrainian drones, trapped by FPV strikes, and finished by heavy artillery. In modern warfare, losing heavy armor is expected. The real shock lies elsewhere. The crisis is how these losses cripple their ability to shield infantry, maintain operational tempo, and force a breakthrough. What happens when an army designed for massive armored breakthroughs is forced to fight with a severe deficit of vehicles? That vast Soviet stockpile was meant to be the iron shield of their entire land doctrine. But this high-intensity war is eroding that protective barrier one single hull at a time. Historically, their logistics allowed them to rotate battered units out and refit them with fresh hulls from deep storage. A battered battalion could easily draw older T-72s to plug the gaps. Forces short on troop transport would simply receive obsolete Cold War armored personnel carriers. It was an imperfect logistical loop, but it gave commanders the confidence to sustain operations despite massive casualties. This abundance dictated their offensive doctrine. They advanced in rigid columns led by heavy main battle tanks, followed by infantry carriers and support assets tracing the exact same tracks. The tactical concept was simple. Let the armor absorb the initial threat. Dismounted infantry would arrive protected, allowing the combat team to pressure enemy lines until a breach was forced. Early in the invasion, their massive numbers allowed them to absorb tactical failures and keep pushing forward. As modern assets burned, older mothballed platforms were quickly reactivated. T-80s, 72s, T-62s, and even T-55s entered the theater, proving how desperately they were digging into Cold War stock. Yet deploying legacy armor exposes a fundamental vulnerability in their operational capability. These systems are not returning because they match the demands of the modern battlefield. They are deployed because combat attrition is unsustainable, and their readily available armor reserve is far more depleted than they ever anticipated. From our tactical observation, this systemic stress is obvious long before their columns reach the front. An enemy assault force might still project strength as it rolls out of assembly areas. Lead tanks clear the route. Infantry carriers trail behind, flanked by logistics engineering and command assets. To troops on the ground, it looks like overwhelming combat power. But from a drone's perspective, it is just a slow, vulnerable line of targets tracking through open corridors. This is precisely where legacy Soviet doctrine completely falls apart under modern conditions. Numerical superiority is useless if your platforms cannot coordinate, survive the approach, and advance under fire. Today, that is nearly impossible. Airborne reconnaissance tracks the route while lethal FPV drones wait at pre-mapped choke points. Pre-sighted artillery is dialed in, waiting for the column to bottleneck and stall. When the lead vehicle is immobilized, the tactical cost of using legacy armor skyrockets instantly. It is not just about a single lost hull. This systemic drain alters the entire strategic balance of the campaign. As any logistician knows, a hull dragged out of mothballs is not combat ready. When platforms are cannibalized, damaged during transit, or fielded with obsolete armor, the operational integrity collapses. The strategic reserve remains massive on paper, but combat ineffective in actual operations. The tactical reality is simple. Russia's doctrine relies entirely on protected movement. Their infantry cannot cross this lethal ground without armor. As their armored reserves bleed out, they can still assault. But the tactical execution must change. That is the true warning of their depleting Soviet stockpile. Their massive Soviet inheritance will not vanish overnight. Instead, we watch it drain away through relentless, costly assaults, leaving behind shattered columns, abandoned tanks, and obsolete hulls dragged from the deepest reserves of their warehouses. The critical question for any commander is not just their remaining inventory, but how much of that heavy armor can actually survive in a modern drone-saturated battle space. In my assessment, these columns lose the initiative before firing a shot. Modern surveillance maps their coordinates long before they reach the front line. The moment an assault element departs its staging area, the threat level spikes. An overhead surveillance asset is already monitoring the advance, plotting the roads, the forests, and the narrow choke points they must navigate. To the crews on the ground, the advance looks dominant. Armor leads the charge. Infantry combat vehicles trail closely behind, with logistics assets following the exact same tracks to sustain momentum. But from an aerial perspective, the reality shifts. The column is reduced to a predictable vector. Every turn betrays their destination. Every halt exposes a critical vulnerability. Interval gaps reveal their cohesion to opposing operators. Suddenly, these tanks are no longer just heavy steel pushing toward our lines. They are merely telemetry points funneled through restrictive terrain that strips away maneuverability. This is the true value of early warning. As tacticians, you and I know that striking immediately is a mistake. A drone can shadow the column for miles, tracking its movement through open fields, shattered highways, and urban fringes. The longer we observe, the more intelligence we gather. We observe precisely where the vanguard slows, where the armor bunches up, and where the logistics tail loses contact. Tactical patience completely alters the engagement cycle. Their crews mistake velocity for security, yet high speed only forces them into predictable narrow channels. Heavy armor simply cannot ignore terrain constraints. They are bound to established roads, trails, and cleared axes of advance. Once these axes are monitored, the element of surprise is lost long before making contact with the defense. The critical danger zone is rarely the open field, but the inevitable choke point where the formation must compress. A simple bend in the road forces vehicles into a straight file. While a tree line blinds the crews on the ground, the aerial observer retains perfect visibility. Nearby ruins and cratered streets further degrade their speed and maneuverability. These variables dictate exactly where we set the trap. With the route-mapped FPV drone, assets are integrated into the engagement plan. There is no need to hunt individual targets across open ground. Our teams wait for the column to enter restrictive terrain where maneuver is paralyzed and reaction times plummet. That is precisely when the battle space closes in on the attacker. This presents a devastating tactical dilemma for opposing commanders. Their vanguard still advances, but tactical control has slipped. We have read their scheme of maneuver. Their intervals are calculated. The optimal kill zones have been mapped. Defending artillery and drone teams lay their traps proactively rather than scrambling to react mid-assault. From inside the hatches, the crews see only a narrow viewport and the smoke of preceding casualties. But from above, our operators command a total view of the battlefield. We easily isolate the lead tank, the troop transports, and the vital logistics vehicles keeping them running. This comprehensive intelligence allows us to choose where to strike. That is the real shift in modern warfare. An assault column may possess massive firepower, yet lose the advantage through early detection. If you and I analyze how drones have redefined armor survival, a bigger question emerges. Can heavy armor still spearhead major offenses when an eye in the sky compromises them before contact is made? Immobilizing the lead vehicle is typically the trigger that transforms an active armored assault into a stationary shooting gallery. Once a column hits a tight choke point, a ruined tree line, or a minefield entrance, the lead platform holds the fate of the entire formation. That first vehicle is more than just armor. It dictates momentum, clears the path, and guides the unit. As long as that lead element pushes forward, the tactical rhythm remains intact. If that lead asset is neutralized, the entire assault fractures. This is the exact operational window where FPV drones excel. They do not need to wipe out the whole column. They only need one precise strike at the critical moment. A low-altitude strike from the flank can disable the lead tank's engine, stalling it directly across the primary axis of advance. Within seconds, a coordinated advance degenerates into a blocked corridor choked with smoke and chaos. The trailing elements are forced into a split-second crisis they never trained for. Some drivers slam on the brakes to avoid collision. Others frantically scan for bypass routes. A few crews will try to push through to preserve momentum. But on this restricted terrain, every choice carries lethal consequences. Veering off-road exposes them to mines deep mud, or side armor strikes from waiting drones. In my experience, hesitation on the battlefield spreads far faster than command orders. One stalled vehicle forces the next to halt, instantly tactical spacing collapses, armored personnel carriers bunch up and support vehicles lose their vital safety margins. Drivers wait for orders, but with the route blocked, radio nets quickly dissolve into chaos. This is when the enemy artillery takes over with a massive tactical advantage. A moving target is elusive, but a static, bunched-up column is an artillery crew's dream. Overhead reconnaissance drones feed real-time coordinates back to the battery as the convoy sits idle. The gun crews do not have to guess where the bottleneck is. They simply rain steel into the kill zone where the armor is trapped. The initial artillery impacts trigger a secondary wave of destruction. They might not score direct kills on every hull, but they compound the panic, smoke, and craters in an already broken formation. Enclosed crews hear shrapnel tearing through air, while drivers struggle to see if any path forward remains open. A fresh crater or a blazing wreck will seal the last remaining escape route. Then the drone swarms return to mop up. They ruthlessly hunt down any asset still attempting to maneuver. A tank attempting to reverse exposes its vulnerable rear armor. An armored transport trying to bypass a wreck exposes its flanks. Any support vehicle stopping out of panic becomes an easy kill. This is no longer a standard ambush. It is a cascading tactical failure. This is the classic kill box the defenders engineer. Drones shatter the operational tempo. Artillery hammers the resulting bottleneck. Drones maintain persistent surveillance, converting every desperate move into a fresh target for the battery. For the opposing command, the loss is far greater than a single lead vehicle. The devastating blow is the loss of command and control. With the lead platform dead and the route-blocked, unified maneuver becomes impossible. At that point, individual crews act on survival instinct, and a rapid armored breakthrough degrades into a sitting target line waiting to be systematically destroyed. As the formation disintegrates, the threat shifts from burning armor to exposed infantry fighting for survival in the open. Once the lead elements are ablaze and the route is choked, the enemy column ceases to function as a cohesive force. Desperate crews attempt to bypass the burning hulls, but the corridor is too tight. The shoulders are often mined, bogged with mud, or zeroed in by drones. As vehicles attempt to reverse, they trigger a whole new crisis. A heavy tank or personnel carrier maneuvering under fire inevitably exposes its weak rear and engine bay. This presents a perfect target profile for waiting drones, and that is when outright panic takes hold. Units stuck at the tail of the column have zero situational awareness of the vanguard. They observe smoke debris and brake lights, but are completely blind to the larger tactical picture. Dismounts inside the metal hulls, hear the impacts closing in, forced to decide, stay protected by steel or bail out before the next drone strikes. In my assessment, neither choice is viable. The very armor designed to protect them has now sealed their trap. Tactical command inevitably breaks down at the worst possible moment. Pre-planned orders quickly lose all relevance as the reality on the ground shifts. One vehicle attempts to reverse, another pivots toward the tree line, while a third stalls, waiting for space that never clears. The convoy loses all operational cohesion. Individual crews begin acting purely on fear instinct and obscured sightlines. This is the exact moment a coordinated, mechanized push degenerates into a scattered group of isolated targets. Dismounting the vehicles soon becomes the infantry's only perceived chance at survival. Troops scramble for the woodline, seek cover in drainage ditches, or huddle against disabled hulls. Hiding behind a burning tank feels safer than facing open ground, but in modern drone-dominated warfare, these wrecks simply serve as targeting markers for the enemy. Aerial surveillance easily detects movement along the tree line, and troops clustering near a destroyed vehicle immediately expose the location of any survivors. FPV drones now shift their operational role from disabling heavy armor to neutralizing surviving personnel. They begin hunting for the smallest signs of life. An infantryman leaping from a crippled carrier and sprinting for the woods quickly becomes a high-priority target as the overhead drone tracks his path. Two soldiers navigating a drainage ditch may believe the depression shields them from view, but an FPV drone requires only seconds to acquire the target and commit to a terminal dive. Gathering in larger clusters under canopy cover also invites disaster, as thermal optics scan the area specifically for heat signatures and improvised shelter zones near the contact line. Supporting artillery fire further complicates egress by rendering the entire zone unstable. Impacts along the roadway drive survivors into the open, while concentrated barrages on the woodline effectively deny them their primary escape route. This creates a devastating tactical dilemma. Staying inside the armor is fatal, yet the dismounted battle space is entirely under enemy surveillance. The troops are cornered in a lethal zone where any movement risks immediate exposure. When armor fails to protect its payload, the entire doctrine of mechanized assault collapses and lethality shifts from the vehicle to the crew. It relentlessly pursues the dismounted infantry who relied on that armor for survival. Our analysis of satellite imagery reveals that this mechanized attrition crisis extends far beyond the active front. It exposes deep vulnerabilities in the strategic reserve. Historically, these depots presented a simple, formidable picture. Endless rows of armor stood in open reserves waiting for overhaul deployment or to be cannibalized for parts. This inventory served as a strategic guarantee that heavy frontline losses could be continuously sustained and replaced. But that tactical reality is shifting. Storage yards are rapidly emptying, leaving behind hulls that are heavily degraded, incomplete, or obsolete. From a logistical standpoint, a chassis in a depot is vastly different from a combat-ready asset. A hull is useless without a functional engine, modern optics tracks, secure communications, or operational weaponry. Cannibalizing multiple hulls to field a single vehicle inflates superficial numbers while masking a severe deficit in real combat power. This is the critical bottleneck hidden within these depots. Having massive stockpiles of legacy armor does not translate into deployable combat-ready mechanized units. This logistical strain explains the tactical shifts we observe near the front. With sufficient armor, commanders can execute rapid, protected maneuvers to overwhelm enemy defenses. Tanks spearhead, the advance carriers insert the infantry, and support elements maintain operational momentum post-contact. When that baseline weakens, the nature of the assault changes completely. Infantry is increasingly deployed on foot, using civilian transport quad bikes or motorcycles. While these light mobility tactics maintain pressure, they cannot substitute for the survivability of heavy armor. A motorcycle offers high speed over rugged terrain, but zero protection against incoming artillery fragmentation. All-terrain vehicles navigate fields rapidly, but remain entirely defenseless under the watchful eye of enemy drones. Unarmored civilian vehicles can transport troops near the front, but they easily disintegrate under indirect fire. The battle space is turning increasingly lethal for enemy infantry. Stripped of heavy armor units must exploit speed, micro-terrain, smoke, and precise timing. They infiltrate tree lines, dash through ruins, or stage on secondary routes for the next assault. But the same reconnaissance networks hunting tanks are tracking these dismounted movements. What seems like tactical agility on the ground is easily targeted from above. Ukraine forced this tactical shift by targeting far more than just frontline armor, striking the logistical choke points and support networks, while FPV drones paralyze armor at the zero line. Artillery devastates any hostile clusters trapped in narrow choke points. Precision interdiction on supply lines chokes the flow of fuel, ammunition, and recovery assets needed to sustain high-tempo maneuver warfare. This triggers a cascading attrition loop, forcing losses on the road to disrupt depots, repair facilities, and operational planning. We must understand that Russia's pivot to infantry-heavy assaults is not merely a localized tactical choice. It is a symptom of systemic friction. While Moscow must maintain offensive momentum and probe Ukrainian defenses, they no longer possess the armored mass required to execute doctrine the old way. Consequently, lighter and cheaper auxiliary platforms are forced to bear the operational weight. The key operational question is whether Russia can adapt before Ukraine neutralizes their remaining armored fleet. If Moscow refines electronic warfare and recovery operations, and tightens tactical coordination, they might preserve some combat power. Otherwise, the Soviet inheritance will deplete into a paper army, leaving light infantry motorcycles and unarmored platforms to hold the line. These assets were never designed for high-intensity shock action. Russia's armor reserves are not collapsing overnight. Instead, we are witnessing a slow-bleeding convoy by convoy, repair depot by depot, assault by assault. This dynamic goes far beyond pulling obsolete T-72s, T-80s, or even T-55s from storage yards. It is the erosion of a decades-old doctrine colliding with a battle space where every movement is detected and immediately engaged. Ukrainian forces use aerial reconnaissance to spot advancing columns early, pinning them down, then coordinating artillery and strike drones to systematically dismantle the force. The strategic shock outlasts the smoke. As armor deficits mount, hostile units increasingly depend on all-terrain vehicles, civilian trucks, motorcycles, and dismounted advances. These improvised tactics can maintain pressure along the forward edge, but they lack the armor speed and raw shock power of heavy platforms. The strategic landscape is shifting. The tank is not obsolete, but conventional armored doctrine is facing terminal pressure. Without effective counter-drone shielding, the Kremlin's massive Soviet stockpile will shift from a major operational asset into a costly burning liability. How do you assess this? Are we watching a temporary adaptation, or has the era of mass armored maneuvers closed forever? For more strategic analysis on modern weapons doctrine and the geopolitical forces shaping this conflict, like, share,